Okay. So good morning and welcome on board. Today's discussion and webinar is being organized by West Bengal Right to Education Forum in collaboration with Right to Education, National Right to Education Forum. This forum is represented by almost 100 organizations across the state of West Bengal and collaborates with National RTE Forum since 2012, ensuring proper implementation of RTE in the state of West Bengal. Even during the lockdown situation, it has launched a study of the children facing numerous disruptions as the schools are closed and shared with education department and all other stakeholders. We are actually deeply concerned about reopening of school and would like to assess the situation by reaching out to children and their parents and teachers across the 19 districts of West Bengal and share the same with government by third week of February, as it has been planned now. However, today's discussion on Shiksha Samvad, which is the seventh round, as Shaheen said, uh, which is again a collaborative effort uh, between the West Bengal RTE Forum and National RTE Forum towards end equality and increase budget for education. In this context, we take on the issue of new education policy and its implementation challenges, especially when India's union budget for financial year 2021 and 22 comes at a critical time as the economy enters a recession. Subsequently, the state budget sessions will follow. India has brought in life the new education policy 2020 after almost 34 years. Uh, as the last policy was in 1986, and before that, one was formulated in 1968. Of course, there was an amendment in 1992. The NEP 2020 took over 5 years' time in its making, with several committees putting their insights and visions, and was approved even without a parliamentary debate. The reason is the reason as we all know, the unprecedented uh, COVID-19 pandemic has impacted the lives and livelihood of millions of people, while the economy was in severe decline. Uh, Educational institutions, as you all know, during COVID-19 was all closed. Till now, it is closed for several months, and large numbers of children have faced dehumanizing disruptions, anxieties, violence, and dislocations. In this backdrop, should we begin to look at this policy through the perspective of the rights, especially of those who matter most? And if so, how would that happen? A roadmap is missing, though NEP takes a giant leap towards uh, uh, it takes a giant leap towards transforming educational discourses for children in India. It now has extended 3 to 18 years of education year. According to the National Education Policy 2020, the 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4 structure will replace the existing 10 plus 2 structure. This structure is focused on students' formative years of learning. This 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4 structure corresponds to the ages from 3 to 18 years. Uh, that is 12 years of schooling. 3 years if Anganwadi and preschooling are included in the structure. The government aims to make schooling available to everyone with the help of NEP 2020. Approximately 2 crore school children will be able to come back to educational institutions though this through this new approach as it promised. And For children up to age of 8, a national curriculum and pedagogical framework for early childhood care and education will be designed and developed by NCERT. But there lies a world of difference between the laying down a policy on paper and following it in the spirit. NEP fails to discuss how this can be achieved. This indicates a need for greater public funding, as we all know, which in reality does not sit well within the current scenario. The increase in education budget from 3% to 6% GDP is simply not enough to meet the implementation needs. Now, the issue that needs to be flagged here is whether and how our state would be expected to rise to the occasion when, notably, the policy commits to increasing public expenditure on education to 6% of GDP from the current 4.43% or something like that. And however, it is unclear how this increased expenditure will be shared between the central and the state governments. Now, for with this flagged issue, we have two of our very eminent speakers with us today. Dr. Achin Chakraborty, Professor and Director, Institute of Development Studies, Kolkata. His special areas of interest is welfare economics, then microeconomic issues in development economics and human development. And we have Mr. Prabhat Kumar, who is the social policy specialist in UNICEF. And his special area of engagement has been in analyzing states' allocation of spending for children in state budget. So uh, I think I will not expand any more on this issue, and I would request first Dr. Achin Chakraborty. Over to you, Dr. Chakraborty. And for the time, I think Dr. Chakraborty, it will be 20 minutes. You continue.
Sure. 15 to 20 minutes.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Sure. Thank you, Mr. Basu, and I'd like to thank the West Bengal Right to Education Forum for opportunity to share thoughts on education prior to the budget, central and state budgets.
Thank you.
As Mr. Basu has rightly pointed out, that this is the unusual year. I mean, pretty unusual year because of the pandemic, and as you know, that because of the pandemic, the economic fallout of the pandemic has been really disastrous in terms of contraction in GDP, and you must have seen in the newspapers that the contraction in the two subsequent quarters, and it's negative 24%, and so it turns out that 2020-21 will end with a negative rate of around 9% or so. Estimates vary, but it would be a contraction of 9% at the end of this year, in this financial year. Now, this is a very serious thing as far as the macroeconomy is concerned, and I'm not going to get into the specific budgetary allocations because Mr. Prabhat Kumar is here, and I know him very well, and I know his work. So I'm sure that he would throw a lot of light into the budgetary allocations at the state level, and he has all the facts and figures. I would rather spend more on the larger structural issues and how education budget actually will be formed within these larger structural constraints, and I'll talk about that basically. As I said, that because of the contraction, and you can imagine that the tax revenue would be much less than what was envisaged in the 2021 budget. Now, just immediately after the 2021 budget was passed, the coronavirus infection started spreading. So that's why, these entire calculations in the 2021 budget actually is done, almost, I mean, it's now completely irrelevant now because we don't know exactly how much would be the revised estimates of the budgets and how much we'll end up spending. So this is a real issue, and this 2021 budget figures actually are no guide to 21-22 budget. So this is the first point I'd like to say. At the 2021 budget, if you look at, it's almost like, the continuity of basically the same ratios and proportions. For instance, if you look at the education budget, as you mentioned, Mr. Basu, that it's roughly 4%. I mean, according to economic survey of last year, it is 4.4% of GDP, but there are other estimates which actually say that even below 4%. Anyway, so we take it as 4% in the last year and till the last year. And so it's slightly increased from around 3.1, 3.2, 3.3 to close to 4%. So some percentage point increase in the till the last year. Now that could be a good sign. So, but one has to remember that even 1920 actually ended with a kind of pessimistic on the slowdown in the growth process itself, because the growth process actually started declining even from 1890. So 1890, and gradually in the 4 quarters of 1920, you'll find that the growth rate actually each quarter it declined. So the growth rate finally actually in the final quarter of 1920 was something around 3.6%. So which actually came down from 5.5 to 6, close to 6% earlier. So this is something that, so in other words, this pandemic actually has come against the background of a slowing growth process already there, already set in throughout India. So this slowing down of growth process even before the pandemic hit, and now when the pandemic hit, so that's why we saw this unprecedented contraction. In fact, compared to any other state, any other country in the world, India's contraction actually is one of the largest contraction. And so this is something which is very serious on the macroeconomic front. And the budgetary process actually would be extremely constrained by this process of contraction and the resulting tax revenue collection. As you know, that tax revenue as a percentage of GDP in India, it's somewhat close to 17 to 18%, and compared to other countries, it's still low, because even if you compare with other BRICS countries, it is still low. So for quite some time now, many people have been arguing for a greater tax mobilization, at least to raise it to 25% of GDP or something, but we couldn't do that. Next comes this expenditure, particularly the social sector expenditure. Now, when we have experienced this kind of pandemic, and you can imagine that the immediate knee-jerk reaction would be to spend more on healthcare. So because of popular demand, because the governments would actually like to show that they have really they have been trying to revamp the healthcare infrastructure, something like that. So the spending on healthcare would definitely go up because of this popular pressure, because of the because the government would like to see that they're really not ignoring the healthcare sector. So if you look at these broad expenditure heads over the past several years, maybe 15, 20 years, you will see that there is a very interesting pattern actually, on which I wrote earlier, there is a very interesting pattern because if you look at these broad expenditure heads, you'll find that, if you categorize into social sector expenditure and other, discretionary expenditure like, rural development, things like that, in which, MG and REG is the larger part. You'll find that when the government actually allocated a little bit more on MG and REG, then you'll see that the allocation to social sector, health, education together slightly came down. So in other words, it's a kind of process that, government, as if, the total actually remain more or less the same. And within that, social sector and rural development competed with, compete with each other. Now, that's something that is very interesting that, and during the election years, particularly just before the election year, you'll find that MG and REG money allocation actually went up, but health and education actually slightly came down. Now, why is it so? Because earlier, I mean, before the pandemic, that in the normal situation, health and education budget actually there's no constituency for that as such. To raise the percentage allocated to social sector, there is no sort of vocal and united constituency for that. So that's why. But on the other hand, MG NREG has direct, sort of benefit in terms of, the electoral returns. So that's why, during the election year, you see that usually this direct benefit transfer in the form of MG NREG actually went up. So that is the past. I mean, I'm talking about the past. So in the past, actually, I mean, if that is the pattern, then one can imagine that even now, even within this social sector, if health actually demands more because of this, more awareness about health structure, then obviously education would be the victim of that. So in other words, in the political process of budget making, I mean, if I call it so, then education will be the victim. That's my hunch. You know why? Because during this time, in fact, raising education budget at the cost of any other competing sectors like, either rural development or healthcare would be really, really difficult. Now, this is a political economic question, and I don't know to what extent we would succeed in raising this percentage allocation to education to 6%. Now, 6% actually has been there for long, right? I mean, from 1968, even starting from Kothari Commission and then all the commissions, in fact, they all mentioned about this 6%. But, we haven't been able to raise that percentage in subsequent budgets. So, if the country wants to raise it from 4% to 6%, then you have to have some kind of roadmap. I mean, you cannot do it in one budget, right? So you have to have a roadmap, like, within 5 years or within 10 years. So this would be roadmap so that, each and every subsequent budget, you allocate, slightly more so that eventually you reach in 5 years time or something that you reach 60%. Now, that kind of roadmap actually is nowhere seen. So this is the crucial part of it, because even new education policy, if you go through new education policy, you'll find national education policy that 2020, you'll find that nowhere actually it is mentioned that roadmap, that how one can actually raise this percentage of allocation to education as a percentage of GDP from 4% to 6%. The roadmap is nowhere there. So this is a kind of very fuzzy area where actually we really don't know how it can be raised further. The other kind of constraint is that all the state governments are going to face this challenge of fiscal deficit, no doubt about it. So the fiscal deficit, till last year for West Bengal, it was something around 2.8%. I mean, within the limits of that FRBM Act. The FRBM Act actually stipulates that a state government's fiscal policy should not fiscal deficit should not exceed 3% of its GSDP, gross state domestic product. And for West Bengal, until last year, it was 2.8, and the budgetary also around that. So it was within limit of 3%. But now already you know that because of this, this reduced center to state transfer, particularly on account of GST compensation. So all these things, because of GST compensation, is a part of it still pending. So because of this less and less center to state transfer part, and also the own tax revenue is extremely limited for the state. So you can imagine that the total revenue available would be far less than what was budgeted in 2021. So in 21-22 budget, I'm not sure that how much actually the state government would be able to allocate in education in what is called discretionary part of it. There is a kind of committed part and there is a discretionary part of it. The committed part is that the salaries of the people and all this administrative expenditure you have to make this committed part. But the discretionary part, actually, where it comes to particularly capital expenditure on classrooms and things like that. And classrooms, we are somewhat okay so far in terms of number of classrooms and or student classroom ratio. But the non the discretionary part will I'm sure that it will be further curtailed, simply because the state government will have not will not have enough money to do that. So this is something which is worrying, because some of the capital expenditure you have to make, because just before this I was hearing the gentleman was talking about that the basically the residual part of the children, the unreached part of the children, that is still we have some out of school children, even though recently the ASER data actually show that that West Bengal is doing fine in terms of controlling dropout, and West Bengal is actually, I mean, according to ASER data, West Bengal was the top in terms of resisting or dropout. So this is a good sign. But if you look at the broad picture of West Bengal's school education scenario, as revealed by the more recent national sample survey data, that is 2017-18 national sample survey data, I would request all of you to look at this national sample survey data or 2017-18, and it is quite revealing in terms of where West Bengal is placed in terms of education. It's not a very encouraging, but it's slightly encouraging. So in terms of its performance, it's almost like in the middle, and so particularly in post-secondary education or secondary and post-secondary education. So primary, I think it's we all agree that primary it is almost universalized, but beyond elementary, that is particularly the secondary schools, number of schools. In fact, number of schools, if you look at the secondary school, the ratio of primary to secondary school ratio, it is still one of the highest in West Bengal. That means per around 4 primary schools to 1 secondary school, in the sense that the including upper primary and secondary. So which is actually one of the highest among the states. So we need more secondary schools probably. And for that, in fact, we need to allocate more, of course, on capital accounts as well. Now, if the primary cut happens on the capital account, then the chances are that you may not get more schools in near future because of this pandemic and all. So this is a serious issue. And if you look at this private public enrollment figures, and we know that in West Bengal, this private enrollment is somewhat low compared to many other states, because private enrollment in West Bengal is not very high compared to other states. It's still less than 17-18% private enrollment. Only recently it has gone up, but until recently it was even less than 10%, where you see that UP, Bihar, even Bihar, UP, and all this, even the poorer states, actually private enrollment is pretty high there. So private enrollment in West Bengal is still low, but there are some low fee paying private schools came out in between, in the past 10 years or so. And these low fee paying private schools will be in trouble definitely after the pandemic, because many people have lost their income. So this in the districts, all these low fee paying private schools actually would suddenly find it very difficult to run. So I think now there is a problem here that the children which actually opted out of the government system and went to these private schools where the fees are not very high, even though quality is also compromised, but the fee was not very high. Now I think that there will be some withdrawal from those schools, and they would come back to the government schools. And that's a good sign in one sense, that government schools would be further. I mean, there is a need, there is a kind of case for further strengthening the government schools because of that. Because it's not the children or the parents are opted or opting out of the government schools. No, in fact, there may be a reversal of these children from these low fee paying private schools to government schools. So that actually gives us all the more reason to revamp some of the government schools, where actually enrollment came down a little bit in the recent years. But I'm sure that the enrollment will again go up in these government schools. So for that, actually, we need to revamp some of the schools, which earlier actually we thought that enrollment is not enough in those schools, so they are not viable, and some kind of talk around that. But I think that that scenario also may change because of the pandemic. So there are several issues of this kind, and I am not I don't get further into the more and more micro issues, because Mr. Prabhat Kumar will talk about some of these issues, I'm sure. And the last point that I'd like to mention in this context is that uh, in in the national education policy, you'll find that it starts from pre-primary, right? So this is the first time actually you see that pre-primary is specially emphasized. Preschool children. And preschool children, for that actually you need a kind of elaborate infrastructure. Now all we have now is ICDS, right? So ICDS and some pre-primary schools, government-run pre-primary schools perhaps, or pre-primary class sections in the primary schools somewhere. So that's not good enough. So if we have to implement education policy, the recent one, then we need we need to revamp this infrastructure of ICDS massively, and that requires a lot of money. So this particularly just this pre-primary or preschool part of national education policy, if you want to implement, I really don't know how much money you need to sort of do that. So a lot of money is required just to sort of strengthen our pre-primary education system. Right now, ICDS is not really properly thought of as a pre-primary education as such, because the primary purpose was not that. Primary purpose was basically supplementary nutrition. So that keeping that supplementary nutrition objective as it was, now you have to revamp the education part of it. Now that's a massive job actually. For that you need a lot of investment. But as we right now, ICDS, it's basically, I think it is 65-35 kind of or 60-40 kind of division. The state government actually bears 40% of ICDS expenditure, and the center gives 60%. Now, given that kind of expenditure responsibility, even with that, actually, we know that ICDS is running in okay. I mean, it's okay so far. But if you want to revamp the education part of it, then probably you need more expenditure on the part of both center and the state. Even if you want to keep this 60-40 ratio as it is. But if you keep 60-40 ratio, then it would be further burden the state governments, because the state governments have to find out more money to spend on ICDS or pre-primary facilities. Now, this is another thing. I don't know how. So ideally, if there were no pandemic, ideally, a national education policy would definitely require a lot more money to allocate to even school education, and particularly the pre-primary education. But after the pandemic, we really don't know where this money would come from. And as I said, that my apprehension is that since there is a lot of demand for healthcare, and so the ultimate victim would be probably, I mean, that's my fear, that ultimate victim would be education. The last point, because now we are talking about revamping the economy. Now, revamping the economy, how? Now, the central idea is that giving a boost to the investors. Now, investors actually, unless there is more and more, unless the demand improves, investors won't be interested in investing. But the standard practice is that giving a lot of concessions for the investors in terms of cheap credit and things like that. But even the credit is not coming up simply because the investors don't see the opportunity to sell the things that they are going to produce. So this is a problem in the economy. But the point is that this is that the government actually has to come out from that kind of investment oriented thinking. Now, here investment is basically the conventional investment in physical infrastructure and physical capital, but human capital is as important as, if not more. Human capital is as important as physical capital. So the government has to realize that a part of human capital is education. So even if of course, the right perspective doesn't allow us to talk about capital here, education as forming human capital. Right to education or rights perspective actually is a different kind of perspective. We can talk about that. But even going by the simple economic logic of capital to boost growth rate, forming capital formation. And so education has a clear case to make here, because if we neglect education now, then we'll suffer in terms of human capital in future, and that would further stymie our growth process. So even to revamp growth process, we should not ignore that education part, apart from the as education as a basic human right, particularly elementary education. We all have accepted that. So I stop here. I think I have spent more time than I have allocated. Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me this. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Achin Chakraborty. You have really brought out many pertinent points and many concerns. You have really flagged many issues. We'll definitely have you on board to continue this kind of discussion for particularly for the West Bengal budget. Before that, if we can meet once again, we will keep on continuing talking on these issues. Thank you so much. And now I would request Mr. Prabhat Kumar. Mr. Prabhat Kumar, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Am I audible?
Good morning. Yes, you are audible.
So thank you very much. Let me thank the organizers first, the National RTE Forum and West Bengal chapter, for having me here. And I was very happy when I got to know that Professor Achin Chakraborty is the co-panelist. It's always a pleasure to be in his august company and to listen to him, because the way he brings out the issues in a simple and a very succinct manner that all of us can agree, and further it opens up new areas for us to discuss more. he has also set the context so well that it's easy for me now to deliberate on certain things. But before I share my views on the topic of interest today, I would like to just mention a few things. The first is that all that I say is my views, my personal views. It may not necessarily subscribe to my organization's view. The second is that the evidences and the data which I'm going to talk about, it draws heavily on the work which has been done by the budget groups as Accountability Initiative or Center for Budget Governance and Accountability. So I give my due credit to the authors and their hard work. Avni Kapoor, Mridusmita, Subrat Das, and their teams which have worked on this. Let me just start by saying this, that a very simple, the concept and understanding what we have, that if any result we want to achieve, there are necessary conditions and there has to be sufficient conditions both met so that we can achieve. So in principle, there is nothing wrong in being very ambitious, when we set a program objective, whether it's new education policy or for that matter in any sector. But after having set the very ambitious objectives of the policy or the program, it also needs to be backed with sufficient resources, and so that the necessary conditions can be met to achieve that. Now, in a classical way, in a very classical way, what we say, that what is the way that there are inputs, and then we undertake certain activities to achieve outputs, outcomes, impacts, and goals. Now, when it comes to achieving any result, if I may just say that the three most critical inputs, what could possibly be for any program, not only education, but for any program, it will be the fund, which is like the financial resources. It will be the human resources. And when I say human resources, I'm not only referring to the quantity part of it, the number of the posts filled in, vacant, things like that, but also the quality part of it. What is the capacity the human resources have to deliver? And the third critical input would be the infrastructure. Because if we don't have infrastructure, then it will be very difficult to undertake certain processes, certain activities to achieve the results. Now, as it is generally, said that in from the public finance perspective, and Professor Achin Chakraborty touched on this part. So we have a new education policy, and we also need to have a renewed commitment for funding for certain things. But suppose if we take a minute and look into that, what is the public finance management system? Even if we take the education sector itself, so that would also need a reform. That would also need, lot many changes. Otherwise, it will not help. The current system may not help us to achieve the objectives of national education policy. And classically, what we say that when I say public finance management, so it is about efficiency, it is about effectiveness, it is about equity, it is about transparency and accountability of the entire budgetary processes. Now, what we understand is that all these aspects are very important. I mean, we say that how much of the public resources required or needs to be invested. The second question comes, which is about the quality of expenditure, that how well public resources are actually invested. And the third, not to forget, which is I think more like needed, is how inclusive are the public resource investments. I mean, who are the most deprived? Who are the people who are going to be affected by certain decisions the most? And probably who are those who are always left out? So where is the focus on that from the equity perspective? So these three things, I mean, this is all three are required, all three are essential, and we have to see. Now let's look at some of the like the other things that the challenges what we face. Now, as we know that in 2020, there were two very historic things happened. So one is the pandemic, and then another is the national education policy was released in July 2020. But if we look at the the process of approval, the process of allocation, the process of release, the expenditure, and we further delve into the component wise budgets, and that what is the readiness of schools in terms of infrastructure. And I'll also throw some light on the digital infrastructure, because today we are in a situation that it has been realized that ICT or the digital access or the digital divide is going to further accentuate the problem. Now, classically, in any budget analysis we do, what we find, and this is true for any sector, so this is not something very specific to education sector, that there is a huge variance between, like the budget estimate, the revised estimate, and the actual expenditure. Other than various, what is the disturbing part is that while budget estimates, we see that over the period of time, the budget estimates keep increasing. So it's like a dream I want to achieve. Revised estimate is that the reality that, okay, how much, like the dream can be realized. And actual, by the very fact, it's actual expenditure, So we see that, actual expenditure is much, much lower than the budget estimate, and certainly also lower than the revised estimate. Now, suppose if we talk about this whole, the allocation process. Now, suppose if the budget was approved, like if I talk about financial year 2018-19, 34,000 crore being approved, and revised allocations were only 30,781 crores. So herein, I would like to bring one point. Now, if you look at the entire planning process, the time and the energy and the resources which are invested in it, and then when we see lots of variance between what was approved and what was allocated, so then we need to step back and say that is it a worth doing activity? Because that is also, the planning also is a cost intensive activity. It's a time intensive activity. And what is it leading to? When we see that if you do a trend analysis, that the allocation is never close to what was approved or what was planned. Similarly, if you look at the Samagra Shiksha, that for the financial year 2021, that 38,751 crores was the budget estimate. Now, as I said that, budget estimates over the period of time, it always shows a very positive increasing trend. But when we look at the revised estimates, we see that there is a problem. So while the budget estimate was, of 38,751 crores, the allocations were 16% lower than the projected demand of the Ministry of Education. Now, when we look at the projected demand for 2021, then again we see that actual allocations were, much, much lower than that. Now, what happens because of that? That already there is a, like fund cut, or there is a reduction in the budget at that level. The second, when we look at that, okay, so we accept that, okay, whatever gets allocated is the real money, but that is not the story. Even something which has been allocated, if we look at the another challenge, which is the release of funds to the states. Now, what we see that analysis says that the release of fund has been declining over the period of time. Now, this is a very big challenge. So first challenge we face that there is a discrepancy between what was approved and what was allocated. And of that, what was allocated, what was released is further lesser than that. Just to give some data on that, that in 2018-19, 95% of allocations were released, which further dropped to 89% in 2019-20. And 2020-21 being a very difficult year because of pandemic, till November, only 29% of allocations were released to the states. There is another very pertinent point, what we need to look here is that if we do the quarter-wise analysis, that when the funds are getting released by Government of India, so we see that, there is a pattern that towards the last quarter, maximum funds are getting released. And this is, I'm not generalizing this, I'm saying that this is the challenge across many states. And then it would lead to kind of expenditure, which is actually not a desired expenditure, but the pressure is more to spend that money before the financial year ends and before the accounts can be closed. So this is a big challenge. Now, when we are talking about the expenditure, either we can say that, okay, what was the total approved budget, and of that, how much was spent? Rather, more practical would be that what was the quantum of total funds available? which is like actually the funds which was released by both the government of India and the state governments, because that would impact on the expenditure. And again, herein I don't have a very encouraging figure to share, because when we look at the expenditure by the states of the total approved budgets, what we find that it has been low and it has been declining. For example, like in financial year 2018-19, the expenditure was only 64%. 2019-20 it dropped to 59%, and 2021, as I said, that it was a very difficult year, so only 26% was the expenditure in the first 7 months. So expenditure is also impacted by both quantum of money and the process by which the funds gets released, or the time, like lag in which the funds gets released. Now, for West Bengal also, we saw that, there is a decline in the budget approved. Like if we take 2020-21 and if we compare it with 2019-20, so it's minus 1%. Now, when we look at the expenditure, again, what we see that West Bengal expenditure for the financial year 2019-20 was only 62%. Now, whatever I'm saying, if you can reflect in the light of what Professor Chakraborty has said, then you can understand that how the problem is getting compounded. So while we were looking at the big macro issues, but at the end of the day, if I am only spending 62% of what was allocated, then the fund utilization is not good. And if the fund utilization is not good, what does it mean? It means that probably many of the results or many of the key things where it was supposed to be spent, it cannot be spent. Also, what we need to understand that while governments, and as like civil society organizations and as other, like academic bodies, there is a demand for more allocation. But my humble submission would be that yes, please demand for more allocation, but also look at the absorbing capacity. Also look at the capacity of the, the state governments to spend that money. Because if the capacity is not there, then probably having more money is not going to, like better utilize. And as Professor Chakraborty so rightly said, see, the budget is limited and there are multiple priorities. So it's not an easy decision for the government also. And government would not like to allocate more money to a sector where the utilization is low. And it is not desired otherwise also. Now, what, as I said that, like we should also look into the quarter wise that, when the money is getting actually spent, which quarter it's getting spent, because that tells us a lot about the quality of expenditure. If I give one example, like in financial year 2019 and 20, Tamil Nadu had the highest expenditure. Of all the states, Tamil Nadu was the highest. Tamil Nadu had spent 90% of its approved budget. But when you look at that, what is the, like how this budget was spent? So the 99% of the expenditures were incurred in the last 5 months of the financial year. Now we are talking about education sector. We are talking about, certain things which should happen throughout the academic year. So then it's not very comforting to know that last 5 months, something happened, which led to 99% expenditure, and Tamil Nadu becoming the state with the highest expenditure. So this is something. Now coming to, the component, when we look at the various components, so we see that, okay, what is the resources being spent on elementary education? And therein again, Professor Chakraborty has brought it out very, very clearly that we should also look at that, because when we are saying Samagra Shiksha and in the new education policy, the approach which we have taken is actually, from pre-primary, all the way up to senior secondary. So we cannot only focus on elementary education and say that we are achieving our objectives. We'll have to also look at that what is the situation or what is the case with the secondary education. Now, if we look at the budget breakup, for financial year current one 2020-21, so 87% of the total budget is being spent on the elementary education, and only 12% is spent on the secondary education, and teacher education is only 1%. So herein the concern will be that, okay, is this what is desired or something needs to change? Something needs to happen more for secondary education also, because the dropout or this out of school phenomenon and things actually start more from secondary education onward. So we need to be a little more careful on these things also. Teacher education spending 1% is certainly not desirable, because we said that is the quality of human resources which can probably help, because ultimately after a while we start looking at learning outcomes, and then for the learning outcomes result we'll have to look into many more other quality parameters and aspects: training, the number of trained teachers versus untrained teachers, and otherwise also what is happening, new innovations and other things, what is the scope for that. Now, I would also like to touch upon this ICT, like information communications and technology, because this pandemic also exposed that not all of us were impacted equally. I mean, pandemics are never gender neutral or social neutral or otherwise also. So it impacted different groups differently. And from equity perspective, we can see that there is a huge digital divide, and digital access itself is a big challenge for majority of the people. Now, if we look at that, okay, what governments have been doing on augmenting their infrastructure, right? What was the focus? So we see that there are only few states. Now, the good thing is that there are examples from India like Himachal Pradesh, Karnataka, Maharashtra. They have prioritized ICT infrastructure in their annual work plan and budgets. And in the current financial year 2020-21, 4% of the total approved budget was for ICT and digital interventions in government schools in West Bengal. So 4%, okay, maybe we can say that this is a good beginning, but then 4% certainly has to go beyond that, because why I'm saying that, only 11% of the government and government aided schools had computers in West Bengal. So this 4% overall approved budget and expenditure will not be adequate if you want to take this 11% to at least 60-70%. And this, I'm talking only about one indicator, having computers. Then suppose if we talk about internet connections. So while all India average is 12% of the schools, government and government aided, for West Bengal, it is only 7%. So even that needs to improve, because all that we are talking about, the new normal as, like online teaching or digital based teaching and other platforms. So we'll have to do and look into that. Teacher vacancy rate, so again, as I said, that there are three critical inputs, as financial resources, human resources, and infrastructure. So when we look at the vacancy rate, while it is highest in Jharkhand and Bihar, I'm talking about September 2020. For West Bengal, it is 11%. So you also need to look into that, okay, what is the total sanctioned post, what is the filled in post, and those who are in the filled in post, what is the capacity they have, and what capacity improvements are required, for them to actually, deliver better and deliver more. Share of school education in the social sector, obviously it's always highest, to the extent that is actually 84% if I talk about West Bengal only, followed by WCD, which is 13%, and then remainings are just less than 1%. So we need to relook at it in a different way, that if 84% is the total share overall, like total share in the social sector for school education, and of this 84%, around 70% is on salaries. So what can be the catalyst, what can be the change, which can help us deliver the outcomes or the objectives which has been set by national education policy? If we look at allocation and expenditure of Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan in West Bengal, so again, as I said, that budget estimates have increased over the period of time, but when we look at the actual expenditure, or when we look at the revised expenditure estimates, it's not a very encouraging figure. So I think this is all the time which I had, so I'll stop here, and I'll be happy to deliberate anything if there is anything specific. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Prabhat. Thank you very much for sharing a very important aspect of relooking into even the planning process which goes into developing the budget structure in the state before even we consider the 6% of the how this 6% of the GDP will be provided, or whether, and what is the roadmap about it. Uh, it's very important, pertinent points you have really brought out. And now, Biplab, is there any questions to our speakers?
So allow me just 25 seconds, and I would
Yes,
like to just
yes,
offer
yes,
two
sure,
things. So
sure.
what is the learning? The learning is, that we cannot look at one part. It's not either or solution. So while we work on, say, pedagogy, we also have to work on public finance management reforms. We also have to work on certain other processes, the augmentation of infrastructure. It has to be a faceted effort if we want to achieve the objectives of national education policy. It cannot be that, let me first invest more on the teachers quality, and or maybe on infrastructure, and then I'm going to look into other. That way it's not going to help. The second point, I'm taking a cue from what Professor Achin Chakraborty said. So we all acknowledge that in the time to come, the focus will be on health. But my submission, Professor Chakraborty, and to all the esteemed participants is that, okay, so while there will be more fund flowing on health, and in health, we can look at from two perspectives, the clinical side of it and the public health side of it. So my request to the health ministry would be that, cover schools under public health intervention. You give more budget to health, it's required. But we also need more hand washing stations, sanitizations, thermal screening mechanisms in the school, and awareness and like confidence building measures. So bring it all under the public health interventions. And from health, please allocate some money for the school as a dedicated, so that there is a confidence among parents to send their children back. And there is a confidence among the school functionaries that yes, we are ready, we are prepared to receive them and bring them back. Thank you very much.
Yeah, these are very important points. That's true, especially in context of the reopening of the school. Yeah, Biplab, there will be any questions?
Some questions already shared by Mitra Ranjan. Please see your WhatsApp, I think, or somewhere.
Yes, there is a question has come that NEP talks about universalization from 3 to 18 years, but how it can be done without extension of the RTE Act and providing additional budget. So I think this question can be addressed by either Professor Chakraborty or Prabhat Kumar.
Okay. You see that, I mean, there is a difference between a policy document and an act, which is legislated. Now, going back to Professor Amartya Sen's point about this, legislated right versus moral right. And often actually we think that unless something is legislated as right, we are not entitled to talk about rights. Rights in the sense of moral right, or the discourse, the discussions in society, public discussion, we have to have this. So we, in other words, universalization of education till the age 18, that should be part of our moral discourse based on rights language, even though currently it is not legislated. So in other words, if something is not legislated, that doesn't mean that we can't talk about that. So because even if you look at the thing from the other point of view, that is, even after something is legislated, the state can always say that I don't have resources. So legislation is just a means, but we should continue the moral in the rights context rather than the legislated right. So I think that there is nothing defeatist about it, that we don't have this RTE extended till 18 years. There is nothing defeatist about that. We can still continue with our claims. So the claims can be made even without rights legislated. So
Okay.
that's my point. Yeah.
So thanks a lot, and I think
Prabir, I'll just add one more point to it.
yeah,
That
Prabhat.
was my submission to all the participants. that yes, demand for more funds, but don't link everything to the fund provision only. Because while we ask for more allocations, we also have to look into the other challenges. Because having fund alone is not going to solve the problem. We have to look into the entire system by which this education sector and the processes which are run, whether it is about the teacher recruitment, whether it is about the training mechanisms, whether it is about the infrastructure augmentation. So this is all, like we have to look into a multi-dimensional approach. Not that we say that okay, make it 6% of the GDP and 7% of GDP, then, because there is no magic bullet that after something has been made as a 6% of GDP or monies have been allocated, other processes will improve on its own. And this I'm talking about the reforms, which is itself is a very slow process. We are pushed to the wall when we start thinking about the reform, but that approach is not going to help now. We have to be proactively thinking about the sector reform or the sector wide reform, which is required. And then we have to look into that, okay, how, because for governments or for that matter for any organization, when the budgets are limited, the question would always be that how much can be allocated and what is the, how that investment is going to help achieve the objective. It's always a difficult decision. So while yes, from the rights perspective, demand for budget, but I'm saying the voice should not be so loud on the budget allocation that other important things are kind of submerged or subdued. Thank
Yeah,
you.
that's true, Prabhat. And but at the same time, the demand for the increase the budget increment of the budget is required, as you all also said that now it is extended because now three to 6 years also have been included and 15 to 18 years there. So if all these things, I mean 12 years of education practically need more budget, capital fund and all. So in that case, and you are right that technically the I mean the entire processes of budget planning and utilization of it also has to be seen with equal importance. So thank you so much to both the speakers. I think this discussions has gone into the YouTube. Naturally, the questions are not coming here. Definitely, there will be more comments and questions in future. So we'll definitely be referring to you, both of you. And thank you for participating in this very important discussion. Thank you so much.